Hello, calculus students. This is Ms. Orloff, and I am going to work through an AP problem that mainly focuses on fundamental theorem of calculus. Okay, this is kind of a common fundamental theorem of calculus where they give you some line segments or sometimes some semicircles. They give you this graph. This is also a non-calculator. So I want to encourage you to pause the video and read through the problem here in part A. Okay, things that I noticed is that that is a function of f. And I want to make that connection to f and g. I want to make this connection between these two. Now g has been given this integral, but another thing that we have to pay attention to, we're so used to integrals starting at 0, this guy starts at 2. So I want you to take a moment and think about what is the relationship between the graph of f and g. So by using fundamental theorem of calculus part 1, I understand that g prime of x will equal f of x. So this graph is a graph of g prime of x. Somewhere within your answer space on the AP test, you are going to definitely want to denote that. They will look for that. So let's get started. Does g have a relative minimum, relative maximum, or neither at x equals 10? Justify your answer. So relative extrema are nice because I don't need to look at their outputs. Those are just locally. So if you take a moment and you look at that and you make the connection that that is the graph of g prime, though g prime of x equals, g prime of 10 equals 0, and it's a critical point, I don't have any extrema because the derivative never changes signs. So pause the video and write up your justification. I've written my justification very similar to the College Board. The function g has neither a relative max nor a min at x equals 10. So I got to state what's happening. And I have to make a connection right here in my justification if I haven't in my answer space somewhere already. That g of x equals f, or g prime of x equals f of x. And this is where things can be a little different. F of x is less than or equal to 0 on the interval from 8 to 12. So that covers both sides of 10. We also know that there is no sign change for g prime at x equals 10. So we want to now go ahead and look at B. We want to figure out if the graph of g has a point of inflection at x equals 4. And then we're going to want to justify our answer. So take a moment and think, what do I need in calculus to determine if a graph of something has a point of inflection? So if I'm going to go ahead and look at this graph of g prime, what I know about g prime is that I really need to take it and think about g double prime. And I know at 4, g prime goes from increasing to decreasing. I wanted that a different color, sorry. So I have increasing to decreasing. And since g prime goes from increasing to decreasing, I know that there's a point of inflection. I also know that I can say that there's a sign change for g double prime. So in blue, you can see my justification. The graph of g has a POI at x equals 4, since g prime of x equals f of x goes from increasing to decreasing at x equals 4. My recommendation, if you want to discuss in your justification a sign change for g double prime, is I would make the statement that g double prime of x, which equals f prime of x, changes signs at x equals 4. All right, take time and I want you to read Part C, and I'd like you to think about what all you would need to make to determine that absolute extrema. Okay, so this is different than part A. In part A, we needed to think about relative extrema, but now we're going to think about absolute or global. So we're going to find the absolute minimum value and the absolute maximum value on G. And we're doing this over a particular interval, so there's a lot to consider. That's a closed interval. We always check endpoints. The other thing I want to point out is in this case, I'm looking for both the absolute max and min. But if I only ask for the absolute min, I would still have just as much work. I have to always make a candidates chart when looking for absolute extrema that includes all the interior critical values, which are determined by when the derivative of a function is 0 or undefined. I need to find their outputs, and I need to find the outputs of the endpoints. So here we go. Another thing I did not cut and paste in here that we're going to need to realize is that we were given this information. G of x equals the integral from 2 to x of f of t dt. I want you to take a moment and think about all the values that you will have to consider critical and check their outputs. You can see my candidates chart there, and you see that I've left a little space. The rubric from the College Board is not including 2 and 10 because they are neither. However, if you had that extra time on your test, it cannot hurt to add them in or to justify that they're neither. Now, you've already justified that 10 is neither, so it's probably not necessary. But again, you have that option. You could justify that 2 and 10 are neither because of the lack of sign chain for g prime of x. So let's go ahead. I'm going to work through finding one value for you, and then I'm going to have you pause the video and find the values for the rest. So we're going to start with that endpoint g of -4. So that gives me an integral from 2 to -4 of f of t dt. So sometimes with fundamental theorem of calculus, if they did this mainly when it's an application, they will give you initial values, so you always want to see if you have one. In this case, I do not have one. So what do I notice? My bounds are not in the proper order. So I'm going to think about negating and switching my bounds. Now I'm going to use my geometry skills to find the area of all those little triangles. Pause the video and find your area. So I have found my areas, and you can see that in the graph. And now go ahead and take the time to actually find the value of the integral. Okay, and you can see that I found that output to be -4. Go ahead and pause the video and find the values of all of the other points, critical points. Again, 2 and 10 were not included on the rubric, but we would like to go ahead and do that. I've filled out my candidates chart, and if you have, and I've shown a little bit more work. I showed finding g of -2, but if you struggle with finding any of these, please let me know. So by looking at this chart, let's figure out our absolute maximum and our absolute minimum. So when x is -2, it looks like we have our absolute minimum. That's our lowest output. And then if we go ahead and look and we see, oh, this is our absolute max. I'm going to write up a justification as though it was a relative max or min, but the difference is I'm going to include that output. Okay, so here are my justifications. You can see that I include the outputs and the inputs. I always do that with my absolutes. So you can read through that, and if you have questions, please contact me on that. We have one more part to this question, and after we're done with that, I'm going to go through how you would be scored on this problem. Okay, so part D. It's a little tricky. I need to figure out when g of x is less than or equal to 0, so when it has a negative output. And so once again, we've got to remember that g of x was defined by the integral of f of t dt. Well, because I included some information in the sign chart above, that is actually where g of x is 0, 2 and 10. So we know 2 and 10 have to be included in our answer. So we're going to go and we're going to think about that. All right, so I know that 2 and 10 are where g of x are 0. So take a moment and think about this integral and when the function will be negative. So after thinking about it, I hope you have the answer there in purple. Let's quickly run through the scoring rubric. This one is a straight 2 points. You have 2 points. You have to have both intervals to get that. If we go back to part C, let's think about what we need to include. So you get a point for considering the interior critical values. So you get 1 point for considering -2 and 1 point for considering 6. So even if you can't get anything else, you get a point there. And then you get another point for considering the endpoints. So for no other reason, just considering those endpoints and those interior points. Now, to get the last 2 points, because this is a 4-point part C is worth 4 points, you need the answer's appropriate justification. So this again is a 4-point problem. If we go to B, so A and B are 1 point each. You have to have the proper answer and justification. Again, you can't have any bald answer. You can't just say, oh, it's 2, it's 3. So you get 1 point each. And if you totaled up the points I just gave you, you only have 8 points, and every free response problem is worth 9. Where does the last point come from? Somewhere within the answers. When your answer space, you need to make this statement. G prime of x equals f of x. You get a point for that. You forget it, you don't. So you need to make sure you include those things. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care, and let's get ready for this AP test.